Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our program this morning. We hope that you're having a good weekend and a blessed Lord's Day, and we invite you to worship with us today at the Pyburn Street Church of Christ. We will gather this morning at 9 o'clock for Bible study, and we'll have classes available for all ages. Following our Bible study period, at 9:50, we will enter into our worship service for the morning. We also gather again this evening at 6 o'clock, and tonight we will be continuing our study of the subject of angels. We invite you to come and join us for this very interesting study. We also gather on Wednesday evenings at 7 for Bible study. Please know that you are always welcome at the Pyburn Street Church of Christ. Over the last 6 weeks, we have been considering what it takes to become disciples of Christ. This morning we will conclude our study by considering that discipleship must become a lifestyle. A serious look at the gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry reveals that disciples must make a change in their way of life. Many of Jesus' lessons to his disciples and to the assembled masses centered on changes in lifestyle. Take any of the 4 Gospels and notice Jesus' lessons. More often than not, they center on one of 2 discussions: either a change in the way that people lived life or the nature of God's kingdom. These 2 areas can and must run parallel to one another in the life of a disciple. Jesus' revelations concerning God's kingdom differed from first century Israel's expectations. Jesus confronted an enormous challenge in his ministry, and it centered in changing Israel's kingdom expectations. For a change in Israel's expectations to occur, a change in their understanding had to occur. The typical Israelite of the first century expected God's kingdom to be a physical nation, one that would be based upon lineage and heritage, that there would be a king-subject system that would in some manner restore the glorious times of King David, and that there would be a restoration or a purification of their understanding of proper worship in the living God Jehovah. If you wish to consider a specific attempt made by Jesus to refocus first century Israel's kingdom expectations, then read Matthew chapter 13. I want you to notice the parables that are mentioned there. These are kingdom parables. Note the first lesson in each parable is being a part of the kingdom would depend on a heart response of the person, not upon lineage, not upon heritage, and that proper lineage location was not proof that a person belonged in God's kingdom. The kingdom would have a very small beginning, and even though it would begin small, it would grow through influence. To some, the kingdom would be an accidental discovery of a great treasure. To some, the kingdom would be something of great value to be searched for, and when found, obtained with great sacrifice. And the kingdom in its earthly form would contain wicked people just as well as godly people. The Lord knows the difference and will make the difference obvious at the judgment. Now, if you are a Bible student, these teachings may seem so commonplace that they're hardly noteworthy. To the Jewish person in the multitude or a disciple, these kingdom thoughts, though, were radically different from anything that they had ever heard or had ever been taught. So how then does the nature of the kingdom and personal behavior connect? To see the connection, first clearly see Jesus' emphasis on a change in behavior. As an example of this, consider Matthew 5, verses 21 through 48 during the Sermon on the Mount. First, Jesus says that a disciple will not abuse or mistreat others. They will be kind in a devotion to healing instead of holding grudges. Secondly, they will not allow physical desires or needs to create conflicts between them and God's purposes. They will allow devotion to God to guide them in keeping promises and commitments rather than justifying the do-as-I-please mentality. Thirdly, they will keep their promises and commitments. They will keep their word rather than justifying deceit. Fourthly, they will allow God to teach them how to be kind in stressful situations rather than being vengeful and hateful. And fifth, they will allow God to teach them how to love even those that they hate. If you continue to read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6 and chapter 7, and note Jesus' stress on the relationship between devotion to God and changes in personal behavior. Well, how then is an understanding of God's kingdom connected to personal behavior? When we understand God's kingdom, we see that it achieves God's purposes through responses of the heart. We must also understand that this heart response to God transforms the behavior of the person that is responding to God. Discipleship is about living for God because we know God. It's about allowing knowledge of God to change our behavior. Discipleship is not about inactivity. It's not about knowledge with little or no intent of doing. It's not about affirming correct knowledge while justifying ungodly behavior. Disciples follow Jesus to learn how to live, and what they learn is reflected in their relationships, in their commitments, in their values, in their standards, in their consciences, and in their responses from the heart. The disciple continually asks Jesus, "Teach me how to think. Teach me godly feelings and attitudes. Teach me how to act. Teach me how to live." But are you willing to pass this test? In life, the truest tests are formed by real opportunity and actual circumstances. Information received conceives us what we should follow Jesus. Our minds convince us we should follow Jesus. Our voices say we will follow Jesus. Yet when the moment arrives that brings actual consequences to be experienced because we follow Jesus, do we still follow? You know, it's easy to be a disciple if following Jesus produces physical rewards and approval, but it's very difficult to be a disciple if following Jesus produces harsh consequences. Consider with me 3 examples of some common challenges confronting the person who chooses discipleship. And as you consider these 3 examples this morning, realize a person's actual at-the-moment focus of discipleship may be opportunity, intention, surrender. Surrender occurs when both the mind and the body submit. First, I'd like you to consider Judas. When Judas saw the tenseness surrounding Jesus' physical presence in Jerusalem, he saw an opportunity. Commonly, reactions considering Judas' betrayal are emotional reactions. And commonly these emotional reactions are negative and strong. Everyone who knows anything about the Bible dislikes Judas for what he did. And many reasons are behind those strong negative reactions. And likely one reason is fear. Perhaps we resent Judas because deep down inside we understand and relate to him all too well. Perhaps in a way he reminds us of ourselves. Rather than having a strong negative emotional reaction against Judas, let's look at this situation pragmatically. In a recent occurrence, Judas witnessed Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead 4 days after his death. All the area, including the people of Jerusalem, talked about this incredible event. The results were profound, and many believed in Jesus, John 11 and verse 45. The men who were the religious and political elite in Jerusalem and Israel said, "We must do something about Jesus now." Favorable and unfavorable reactions were so pronounced that Jesus could no longer function in public. Remember, the 12 discouraged Jesus from returning to Jerusalem because of their fear that the Jewish leaders would kill him in John 11 and verse 8. They were so fearful that Jesus would be killed that they accepted as fact that they all were going to be killed, John 11 and verse 16. But that did not happen. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus' popularity increased, and though the Jewish leaders hated him, the population loved him. He was so popular that his return to Jerusalem, close to this Passover period, resulted in the people welcoming him in the manner that ancient Israel welcomed royalty. Jesus had power over death. He was untouchable. So Judas saw an opportunity. The Jewish leaders, they were desperate to arrest Jesus, but it had to be in private, because they were afraid that the people would cause problems. Here were people willing to pay money to arrest the man who had power over death and was an extremely popular figure in that area. But Judas saw the opportunity for a disciple who loved money and followed Jesus. The Jewish leaders would pay him money to tell them what and where they could arrest Jesus, but no harm could come to Jesus. His power and popularity would prevent it. Judas would have his money, the Jewish leaders' feeble attempt to confine Jesus would be frustrated, and the end result would place Jesus in an even better position to become Israel's king. Judas saw an incredible, nothing can go wrong opportunity. From Judas' perspective, the result was disaster. He never intended or envisioned Jesus' death. And this is a very sobering example of how perfect opportunities to be greedy and be a disciple failed and resulted in horrible consequences that Judas just could not live with. Friends, evil and discipleship are never a successful mixture. Was it not Jesus who warned that we cannot belong both to God and to material things in Matthew 6 and verse 24? So we can learn from the example of Judas. Next, consider Peter. From the foundation of the 12, Peter was one of the inner three. He was extremely close to Jesus. And of the 12, only he dared trust Jesus enough to get out of the boat in that storm in Matthew 14, verses 24 through 23. Only to him did God reveal that Jesus was the Christ in Matthew 16, 17 through 19. He was one of the three who witnessed Jesus' transfiguration, and of them only he dared to speak. It was Peter who assumed the role of spokesman on the day of Pentecost. It was Peter who was the dominant leader among Jerusalem disciples prior to the events of Acts chapter 10. Peter was confident. He was certain about what he would and would not do. He was determined in his intentions. Folks, when a fisherman draws a sword against Roman troops and the Jewish temple guard intending to fight several hundred men with no armed assistance, he's ready to die. Peter was ready to die defending Jesus if he could die his way by his choice. To die fighting was acceptable, but to be arrested and executed was unacceptable. Peter was sincere and serious in his intentions. However, his sincere intention was based upon doing things his way and in a manner that was acceptable to him. But then consider Jesus. Certainly, Jesus was the teacher. He was not a disciple. The teacher reveals to disciples the way to God, John 14 and verse 6. And we will not pass the test by following Judas' example when Jesus was betrayed, or Peter's example when Jesus was arrested. We will pass the test only by following Jesus' example there in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus clearly did not want the responsibility or the death that was immediately before him, as evidenced in Matthew 26, verses 36 through 39. He fully understood the consequences of his arrest. He fully understood the arrest was imminent. He knew what he wanted. Therefore he prayed, "Let this cup pass from me." But he was willing to do what God wanted. "Yet not as I will, but as you will." God's purposes would not be fulfilled if Jesus followed his personal preferences. These had to be laid aside. He had to fully surrender to God. Whatever God's will was for his life, that's what he had to accept. And that's what Jesus did. And he left us this wonderful example to follow. He was willing to do what God wanted. And God's will was going to be fulfilled through Jesus' personal surrender. God's will was more important than Jesus' desires. Jesus passed that test. He surrendered to God's will. And if we want to be disciples of Christ, this is what we must do as well. Friends, we thank you for joining us for our program today. We pray that the Lord blesses you with a wonderful day.